Great. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Cederholm, and I am a senior associate at Arjuna Capital, where I focus on ESG investing and shareholder engagement. Thank you all so much for joining today's webinar, where we'll be discussing racial and gender pay gap disclosures. And we'll also be talking about the release of the 7th annual scorecard in collaboration with DiverseIQ and Proxy Impact. So in today's conversation, we plan to cover some content, but we also want to leave plenty of time for some Q&A from you all. We'll start off today's webinar with an overview of pay gap disclosures from Natasha Lamb, who is the managing partner and founder of impact investment firm Arjuna Capital, and Joshua Raymer, who is the CEO and founder of DEI data provider DiverseIQ. We'll then move into a conversation between Natasha and Simon Constantine, who is the head of compensation and mobility at BNY Mellon, to hear more about BNY Mellon's pay gap journey, as I know many of you are embarking on this journey yourselves, and hopefully there'll be some lessons learned there. And then we'll end our conversation with Q&A from you all. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to insert them into the Q&A box, and we will make sure to try to get to all of them at the end of this call. So every company that's present on today's call will be included in the 7th annual scorecard. So on this slide here, this is our scorecard timeline. The scorecard is released annually on Equal Pay Day, which typically occurs in mid-March. We don't have the exact date for that yet, but we should in the next few weeks. You all should have received an email from me with a survey link so that you can submit your pay gap data directly to us. We also understand that many of you might be working on enhancing your disclosures currently, or you might be planning to release new data in these next few weeks. So if that's the case, please let us know. Please be in communication with us. My email is right here on the screen, and we'll work with your timeline to try to make sure that we get that data captured in this upcoming scorecard. And as a reminder, the scorecard is looking for current pay gap data, so we will not be considering pay gap disclosures that were made prior to December 31st, 2021. As I mentioned before, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the call, but if you have any more specific questions, or if you'd like to notify me about your disclosure publish date, please feel free to email me at this email address that's listed here on this slide. So now I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Natasha Lamb, who will be providing some more information on the scorecard and also talking through best practice pay equity disclosures.
Thank you so much, Julia. I appreciate the introduction, and also to Simon and Josh for joining us today. It's most appreciated as you're sharing, what you've learned in this space, and also to everybody that is on the webinar today or listening to it as a recording. Thank you for engaging in this conversation, looking at this issue seriously. We really appreciate it. So as many of you know, we've been publishing a racial and gender pay scorecard for the last 6 years. This will be our 7th that we publish early next year. And we've engaged with many companies in our clients' portfolios around the issue of racial and gender pay gaps. So this scorecard provides an overview to investors and companies of the pay equity reporting landscape, and really seeks to educate on best practice pay equity disclosures so that there is consistency across disclosures, and that companies understand what others are doing and what is best practice. So why do we look at this issue? I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with the problem, which are gender and racial pay gaps in the United States, and then of course the global landscape as well. This is looking at this chart here, the median pay gaps for full-time work in 2022, and you can see that for every dollar that white men are making, women are making under 80 cents. Black Americans are making just above 70 cents, and Latinx Americans are making just over 60 cents. When you intersect race with gender, those gaps are even wider. And Julia, if you'll advance to the next The next slide. Here we are in 2023. If the pace of change continued as it had been from 2020, then it would take until 2059 for white women to be paid equally to men, 2130 for Black women to be paid equally, and 2224 for Latina women. So obviously this is a social issue, but why do we care as investors and as companies about this issue? Well, there is a business case to be made for closing and narrowing these gaps. And a lot of that has to do with diversity. So companies in the top quartile for both gender and ethnic diversity have been shown to be 12% more likely to outperform companies in lower quartiles. It's also been shown that actively managing pay equity is associated with improving company diversity. So, when we're engaging with companies and what companies are really looking for is, everybody's looking for the same thing, I think. How can you hire, retain, and promote diverse talent throughout the organization to improve diversity and therefore financial outcomes? So zooming out kind of big picture, 30,000 feet, there's a broader economic case to be made for closing pay gaps. 0.15% of GDP is lost every year because of these gaps. And for the last quarter decade, having racial pay gaps has cost the economy $7 trillion. Gender pay gaps, $5 trillion. If in the next quarter decade we were to close those gaps, $8 trillion would be added by closing racial gaps, and 4.3 by closing gender gaps. So there's strong data to support, why this is important, both on an individual company side and then a broader economic case. So I'd love to dive in for a moment into the different kinds of pay gap disclosures. So when we started working with companies in 2015-16, we started seeing adjusted gap disclosures for the first time. So when a company is looking at pay gaps and they look at what minorities and what women are being paid versus their non-minority and male direct peers, so those folks that are occupying the same positions, is there a gap? Now, that analysis is done taking job into account, taking seniority into account, taking geography into account. It's a very important analysis and disclosure. And typically, a company, if it's doing this on a regular basis, assessing these statistically adjusted gaps, can make pay adjustments, and within a pay cycle or two can remedy some of these gaps. Now, median gaps, which is what I was just referring to, this is what folks are being paid for full-time work. That's a stickier wicket. I mean, that's a harder thing to work on, and it's also critical because it gets to the point of what does the talent pool and diversity look like within an organization across all levels of pay. So the median pay of minorities and women working full-time versus the median pay of non-minorities and men working full-time within an organization. This is the definition that it's literally the definition of the pay gap. It's what's used by the OECD, the Department of Labor. I could name a handful or tons of other organizations that are using this. And again, the gaps tend to be larger. It's reflective of the society that we live in. But it's critical to measure, disclose, and narrow these gaps over time so that there is more access to higher paying jobs for diverse talent within an organization. And I'll just point to the disclosure from Citigroup. This is a 2021 disclosure. Citigroup was the first company in the United States to publish their median pay gap disclosure. And you can see here that on a statistically adjusted basis, it was just a 1 cent gap. But on a median basis, and this is for women, it was a 26-cent gap. So, a big difference between those, both, again, worth disclosing and working to remedy. So I want to dive into the categories that the scorecard is measuring, and we're happy to take any questions about this at the end of the webinar, because we really want the folks on the call to understand, what this best practice pay disclosure is and how it's being measured through the scorecard. So as for categories, we're looking at racial pay gaps, gender pay gaps. We're looking at mandated pay gaps in the United Kingdom and Ireland. The coverage that a company is employing when they're doing their analysis, and then their commitment. So just to go through, for racial and gender pay gaps, we're looking at both the adjusted and the median numbers. The score is a range of 0 to 1. So, if you're Citigroup in this case, you would have a 0.99 for adjusted and a 0.74 for median. If there's no disclosure at all, the score would be a 0. If you've made a commitment, then you sort of get a half score. Same on gender. In the UK and Ireland, we're using the base and bonus median pay data. If you have operations in those companies, in those countries, if you don't, it doesn't count against you. And then in terms of coverage, what components of compensation are being included in the disclosure? So the 3 being base, bonus, equity, or stock awards. And if you're disclosing all, it would be a 1. If you're disclosing only 1, it would be a 0.33. Are 100% of your employees covered? That's the percentage coverage number. And do you have a goal to have 100% of your employees covered if they're not covered today? So you either do or you don't, a 0 or a 1. And then are you doing regular reviews or annual reviews? So some companies in their disclosures don't say that they're doing a regular review, so they would get a 0. There's a bunch of language around we're doing regular reviews or consistent reviews, which is a little wishy-washy, but we would give a 0.75 for that, and then 1 for annual reviews, which is really the best practice. All of these factors are averaged on an equal weighted basis, and then we're scoring from there, from A to F. So Julia's just sharing a snapshot from the scorecard. This is available on our website, and there's a host of information in this scorecard. But this is a fully transparent rubric on what we're looking at, which I just went through, and what the actual numbers are. This is from last year for some of the financial and technology companies that were covered by the scorecard. So thanking again, Simon, for being here. BNY Mellon has been a real leader in this space in terms of disclosure. And so I just wanted to highlight what progress looks like over time on a median basis, and underline that there's no perfect companies. This is not a, oh my God, there's a gap. This is a, what's our gap and how are we narrowing it over time? And there's so many policies and processes and infinity groups and all this stuff that's happening within companies. It's great stuff, but actually being able to measure, well, what's the outcome on median pay over time? So you can see on racial median pay, and this is the racial numbers within the United States. It gets more complicated, obviously, when you're looking globally. Going from 2022 to 2023, you can see that incremental progress. And then on gender, which is measured globally from 2022 to 2023, also see that progress there. And here's just a snapshot of some of the companies that have already disclosed this data, some of the leadership that we've seen by top 100 companies in the United States that have embraced this kind of transparency and are measuring and managing these metrics. So I'm going to turn this over to Josh from DiverseIQ to just give us a little bit more of a sense of what's happening in this landscape. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, so we at Diverse IQ have been looking at disclosures of information around human capital and DEI since 2020. And the first thing that most companies started to think about disclosing, because they were getting pressure and engagement from stakeholders, was EEO1 data, intersectional workforce data, starting in 2020. And it looks the landscape looks kind of similar. At that time, there was only 13 of the largest 100 companies that had made that public. And now, after engagement and pressure from stakeholders, including some of the largest asset managers, that's now 97 out of 100 in just 3 years. And so that was kind of the focus of a lot of the engagement in 2020 and 2021. And now we've started to see a shift from stakeholders focusing on representation to some of the levers that companies can move, and getting a little bit more into the details. So hiring and promotion and turnover data and pay equity are kind of the other two big topics that we've seen engagement on. So in 2023 shareholder season, there were 16 shareholder proposals focused on pay equity, which was twice the number of the last 2 years. And of the 10 that went to a vote, the average proposal received 34%, which was significantly higher than the overall average of 25% for ESG related shareholder proposals. So there's a lot of support from shareholders, and we've also seen just a huge shift in how companies are prioritizing this. Nearly every, or maybe all of the 100 companies say they do a pay equity analysis. They discuss it in their ESG communication, and as you can see from the numbers, half now report the statistically adjusted number, or have committed to. And it's important not just to investors, but to employees and other stakeholders too. So Just Capital does a survey every year of several 100,000 Americans, and they ask basically, what do you think companies should focus on, should provide, should stand for? And the largest issue is fair pay. 21% of the weighting of their survey results goes to fair pay, which pay equity is a part of. And I think the biggest thing the biggest fear companies have is they're going to look bad. That seems to be the biggest reason why companies don't want to make this public. And we saw the same thing with EEO1 data. Is the first few big companies made it public, and then there was kind of the ball rolling downhill. And once that fear goes away, where we can't look any worse, or that's not, we shouldn't worry about that, and it's okay to admit that it's a big challenge and we need to get better. It's more about, here it is and here's what we're doing about it. I think we're going to see the same thing with pay equity. So yeah, in general, this is a big area of focus for every company, and they're kind of figuring out how do we communicate it to the public. I think it's already a big topic internally. We've seen a lot of state laws and bills that are demanding that companies report it and it's being aggregated, or we've seen bills demanding that there's more transparency about pay ranges in job postings. But I think the other big challenge is, in the US, there's not a clear framework for what companies should report, how they should report it, where they should report it. So EEO1 was kind of the low-hanging fruit, because it was already information being reported to the government. All this other information about workforce and human capital and DEI, there are competing ESG frameworks, but unlike in some other countries and regions, there's not a standardized way of how this information should be reported. But because Arjuna has led the way, along with some others in their engagement, and kind of established this as the standard way it should be reported, and because a lot of the leading firms that are conducting in the analysis, this is kind of how they're doing it. I think every company now is looking to this framework and understanding this is how it can be communicated. They can look to some of the companies that have been doing this, like BNY, to figure out how to communicate it so that information isn't lost in translation, and it's not confusing, and they don't look bad. So yeah, I'm excited to hear the conversation between Natasha and Simon. I'll turn it back to you, Natasha.
Oh, Natasha, you're muted.
I was just saying thank you, Josh. We really appreciate the context from your perspective and diverse IQ. I'd love to bring Simon Constantine from BNY Mellon into the conversation now. And Simon, you'll need to unmute yourself as I anticipate the problem that I just faced. But we thought it would be really helpful just to have a little bit of a Q&A and an open discussion between Simon and I. And then we'll open it up for any questions that have come in during the webinar. So if you have questions that have come up, please go ahead and type them into the chat. And Julia is going to help us field those as we go along. So Simon, thank you for joining.
Good afternoon.
I appreciate it. So can you give us a history of BNY Mellon's pay equity disclosures and programming, just kind of off the bat?
Yeah, certainly. So we first started disclosing our adjusted pay in 2018, and that was the result initially of a junior engagement. But it was quite an easy decision for BNY Mellon, and it was led by our senior leadership. So I think that by senior leadership, I'm not just talking about our executive leadership, but also our board as well, because it's very important to them. And I think that, obviously there's things that we feel we should do just because it's simply the right thing to do. And I think that the organization very, very quickly got on board with that, irrespective of the change of legislation and rules, as we saw them sort of progressing over time. And we started disclosing our median pay gap in 2022. And both of those metrics have narrowed over time. And obviously we looked at that a couple of slides ago. I guess one of the things that I'd point out there is that as we do the work in this space, it's an ever continuing journey. It's not a space you get to where you think, aha, I have closed my gap and now I can rest on my laurels. It requires a constant maintenance, a constant attention. So that's just one critical point that I just flagged from the start.
Thank you, Simon. Zeroing in on that shift from just doing adjusted pay in the beginning, which was, important at the time, and sort of as the standard has changed and companies have broadened their disclosure. What inspired BNY to include the median pay gap in their disclosure? Even though there was a gap, and sort of goes to what Josh said, nobody wants to admit there's a problem, but that's the only way that you can, address something, right? And it's not necessarily a problem that will, that any one company has a problem. This is a societal problem. It's a systemic problem. And then all we can do is sort of address it over time. So I'd love to hear, how you thought about that.
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a couple of drivers there. One of which is, if you don't publish, people will instinctively assume the worst. And so I think that actually you have to be transparent in this space to engage your clients, to engage your workforce, to engage your stakeholders. And to not disclose it gives an element, I think, away of something that you're trying to hide. The other critical factor is that if you want to demonstrate improvement over time, well, you have to start from somewhere. And so the way that we look at it here is, yes, we are very interested to compare ourselves to external peers, but at the same time, what we're striving to do is treat each year as our personal best, and we want to improve year on year internally, because I think that's super important. It's not a competition, it's more of an internal focus. And I think as well, we have a broad demographic in our workforce, and we want to be transparent to them. We want to demonstrate our commitment to this space. And I think that the median pay gap is such a powerful statistic, because yes, it's pay, but as I think a few you've drawn out already, it's really a very powerful barometer for representation of minorities within our organizational hierarchy. So again, it's a really useful tool, because then it can be used to pull the conversation into some of the other areas of the human resources agenda that have an impact on this. So as Josh mentioned, hiring, retention, etc. So yeah, so it was a very easy decision.
Yeah, well, I love that. I love that concept of your personal best. It reminds me that my son's doing cross country, and so they have a whole team, but it's only the top 5 that get measured, but everybody else is just sort of working to improve their personal best.
That's it.
So that's an important metric, because for each company, everyone's on their own journey. And so, I like that. I like that concept. How about, I think you mentioned a little bit of it, but what have been the sort of positive results within the organization of having this comprehensive pay gap disclosure?
Okay, so I put it into sort of three main buckets. So one of which is internally with our employees, it demonstrates intent, it demonstrates commitment, and it demonstrates openness. And so, through our various employee groups, through internal communications, we try and highlight this to our employees, and we get a really positive response to our transparency in this space. The second thing that I'd flag is that it's becoming more and more commercially important, I think, to be transparent and to proactively look to narrow our gaps. So, as our clients enter into discussions with us, it's becoming more and more of a topic. Clients will want to know. We will be asked for this in terms of where we stand as we're entering into new agreements. So it's got a big commercial lever to it as well. And I also think that it comes back to this point of it being the right thing to do. Okay, and we are going to see, I think, legal requirements continue to evolve in this space. And so, I think that organizations have a choice to do it when they have to do it when they're forced to do it, or just recognize that this is the direction of travel, and it's better just to get out in front of it and begin to tackle it. And you picked up on something which earlier on, which is about the globality of this, and the fact that we have different legislation evolving in different locations. One of the things that we're thinking about there is, maybe we try and take a more holistic approach and really sort of move to sort of what is the highest bar that we need to achieve, rather than sort of like taking a country by country approach of, we'll do the minimum that's required in every location.
Yeah, and that's something you see a lot, I mean, in business in terms of just strategy. If Europe is doing, has different data disclosure regulations or materials regulations, how companies respond, create products, create policies that adhere to that highest standard because they know that it's coming down the pipe. Doesn't make business sense to just do it for one piece of the organization. One of the things that you mentioned also, employees internally, appreciating the honesty. I know, we've heard over the years, well, our employees aren't going to understand the difference between adjusted and median gap. And, I want to mention it because people do, they're smart. And, I think our observation has been when companies only put out an adjusted gap where they say there's no gap, then the reaction is, well, that's not true when I look around. If they don't address the median gap, because then folks understand it. They're like, okay, I see what that is. And these are the ways that the company is working on it. So that's another thing. Yeah.
And I was just saying, and also, I mean, we're a financial services organization. I don't think we can say that our employees won't understand the difference between adjusted and median. It's sort of somewhat disingenuous to take that approach.
Yeah. And I see over time that that's becoming less and less, but it's something I've heard a lot along the way. Another thing to one of your points is representation, that this is reflective of representation. It's reflective, it's inclusive of representation, but representation data alone does not get to what we're looking for here.
Yes.
And that's critical because I know, within the financial services industry, for instance, it's typically, over 50% women. Now, that doesn't mean that they're in, the higher paying jobs, or when we look at tech, in those engineering jobs, there's lower representation. So it's that intersection between pay and representation. It's so important to measure. Okay, so just kind of getting a little bit into the nitty gritty, and then we're going to turn it over for some Q&A. I think we're right on time. But I'd love to hear about some of the things that BNY Mellon has done over the last couple of years to help narrow these gaps. If there's anything you could share there.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I think it's really what we've done is looked at all areas of the employee's life cycle. So, for example, hiring, promotion, incentive compensation, salary increases, and making sure that every single one of our processes has the appropriate lenses applied to it to make sure that we're making the right decisions. And it's around education of managers. It's also the education of employees. It's about changing, for example, the way that we recruit, the way that we select. Because I mean, there, exits, for example, because a practical reality of a large organization is you do have exit programs over time. You need to make sure that you are consistently looking to, for want of a better word, hire more, promote more, and lose less. And that's the only way you pull this lever. And so, I'd happily go into lots of detail about what those steps look like, but it's about diverse slates when you come to interview, as well as look at your candidates. You need to make sure you have good representation in your interviewing panels. It's about having structure in your compensation programs, I think. So, just a small thing, for example, but we have salary ranges like many companies do, set by level and location and role. We have a check that automatically moves everybody into their new salary range when someone is promoted. It's a small thing. It's not a big chunk of the salary budget on an annual basis, but what it does do is it ensures that you don't have anybody be promoted up through the organization and begin to lag over time, their peers, because they've been promoted quickly. So these are just small trips, but at the end of the day, it starts with the small. It's the small operational steps, and it's communicating those widely and really, really focusing on the decision makers and the allocating decision managers. So it is your line managers, your supervisors, and you spend time with them, and you'll just see it improve naturally, I think, over time.
That's great. Well, thank you for the insight. I know we appreciate it hearing, how BNY Mellon has evolved pay practices over time to manage this issue. And for, peer companies that are on the line, being able to hear from you about what it's been like, going through this disclosure process and, how you've really been a champion at BNY Mellon for fair pay. So I appreciate it. I also just want to say, this is a collaborative process. As we, at Arjuna have, filed proposals with our companies in our portfolios. There's a lot of companies that have been invited this year that haven't received a proposal from us. That's sort of what we're looking for is not a proposal. What we're looking for is progress. And it's a collaborative process. And we really want to bring everybody along. And that's why we created the scorecard. That's why it's transparent. And, we're happy to serve as a resource for folks with questions, which is why we're doing this webinar, and really appreciate you joining. So thank you. And Julia, do you want to help lead some Q&A? I know we've had some questions come in.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So it looks like there's a few questions that came through about the UK scoring of UK pay gaps, and I can answer those right now. So for companies that do not have operations in the UK or Ireland, we make sure that we don't discount those companies for not making disclosures specifically there. Or for companies that don't meet the threshold. I think you have to have about 250 employees in the UK or in Ireland in order to be mandated to make that disclosure. So the denominator, when we take the average, it's simply different. So instead of dividing across 10 categories, we divide across 8 categories, that we make sure that we're not counting against those companies that don't have operations there and aren't mandated to report there.
Yeah, and if there's a company that isn't mandated to report because it's considered insignificant from the UK or Ireland side, that number would not be available, and we would not be including it. So to Julia's point, the denominator would just be 8 instead of 10.
Then another question came through. To answer this one, how does Arjuna select the companies that it chooses to evaluate on its scorecard?
Yeah, so historically, these have been companies that have been engaged by investors. So that's where, we've had the most data and insight and relationship. And so every year it's increased as, not just Arjuna, but other investors have engaged companies. We're really pleased to be expanding the scorecard this year with help from Josh and Diverse IQ, and through the survey. We actually have a lot of companies that reach out and ask to be in the scorecard, which people might be surprised to hear, but we do. And so this year we'll be including the top 100 companies by market cap in the United States, in addition to companies that have been in the scorecard historically. So we won't be taking anybody out, and we'll probably be adding those in that want to be included.
Gotcha. And for the rest of the attendees, please feel free to continue to place questions in the Q&A box, or if you feel more comfortable, you can also directly message myself or the other panelists. So this is another question for you, Simon. How have you gone about educating your employees and shareholders about the difference between adjusted and unadjusted pay differences, pay gaps?
So I think that internally, when we publish our adjusted and median, we will have that covered internally on our internal site, and we will include within that education for the employees to explain what is an adjusted gap, what is a median gap. In terms of the shareholder, what we find is that through the fall season, we'll often have a series of interviews with our larger institutional shareholders, and generally speaking, it's them bringing it to us and asking questions of us in this space because they are interested in it. So it comes up quite naturally in the course of those conversations, and you know, more and more we're just looking for other opportunities to publicize what our gaps are, and therefore that gives us that platform to talk about the difference between the adjusted and the median.
Great, thank you, Simon. Natasha, another question for you. It doesn't always seem like there's consistency in how and where pay gap disclosures are made. Where are you mostly seeing these disclosures?
Yeah, it's a great question. Over time, I would say the least helpful place to put them is on a company blog. And we saw a lot of that in the early years. It's most helpful to have the disclosure if a company is doing a corporate responsibility report, an ESG report, an annual report, to have it there with all of the other metrics that it's reporting on ESG. I think that's the most helpful.
Great, thank you, Natasha. Simon, how does Bank of New York Mellon remediate on a total compensation basis?
That's a good question. So we undertake an annual review of all compensation decisions that are made, and that is for salary, that is for incentive compensation, that is for total compensation. We also look at how our performance rating system works. We also look at our promotions in terms of the numbers that are put forward and the numbers are successful. And so we do a lot of back testing. We are able to identify where we're seeing sort of problem areas or where we're seeing issues, and that allows us the opportunity to proactively then talk with leaders, talk with managers, and make those remedial actions. I think that one of the biggest challenges for organizations is trying to fit that into their compensation process, because to do this properly requires a great deal of statistical analysis if you're going to look at it internally. And anybody who's involved in a compensation round will know how sort of bombastic it can be and how fast moving it is. So it is sometimes difficult to do it real time in of the moment. So there are some checks that we run during the process. There are some that we run after. There are some that we run in advance to ensure that we're starting people from the right place. Now, that is something that I would recommend to people, is that you can identify your outliers, for example, before you get to a compensation round. And therefore, it might be something that you want to think about in terms of where you actually start the planning process. You could have the potential sort of to adjust the starting place for making the compensation decision for folks. So those are just a few things. I think that there are now organizations who are launching third-party software tools that will allow much faster real-time analysis in that space. And I think that is somewhere that I aspire to go. We're not there yet, but I would really like to explore that further, so that actually, and maybe this is where AI will begin to sort of play a role. In a few years' time, a manager makes a silly decision, and the system says back, "Hey, did you really mean to do that? Because what you've just done looks strange." So that's probably the future. But I mean, I think that just for the moment, it's a lot of grunt work in Excel, but we are getting better and better, I think, in terms of automating these steps.
Yeah, it's sort of the double, the two sides of the coin with AI. It can make it a lot better, and then of course there's always bias can sneak into AI too, as we know. So
this is true. This is true.
But I think it's an important point that these processes over time. I know when we started engaging with companies, there were really no consultancy firms that were working on this issue specifically, and there's so many now, and so much different technology, and even with diverse IQ gathering this data, it's just the landscape has changed so much over time. There's a lot more support, and then just to follow up, there was another follow-up question, sort of to your question, Simon. The variable compensation components, like how do you remediate for that? And I think you've spoken to it well. I would just say that what one of our biggest concerns is, if there's bias somehow in base pay, how does bias show up in bonus and stock, right? So it's those pieces in a lot of companies can be some of the biggest components of compensation. So you can't just ignore it,
Yes.
even though it's a bit, it's a bit messier and, can be problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very good point. I mean, without wishing to go off on a tangent, it depends a lot in terms of how you structure your comp. So for example, do you operate total compensation? Is your stock a separate grant, or is it a carve out of the incentive number? You've got to look at IC as well as TC. I think that there's a lot you can do around salary ranges, in terms of maybe narrowing them, maybe making sure that recruitment or as employees are transitioning through them over time, you get people to where they need to be. And I think that that's quite helpful if you operate a total compensation approach. But yeah, there's lots of complexity there. But I do think two things. So one of which is, so long as you can get your PMP, and I'm using an acronym there, I've just realized PMP, my performance management process, right? So long as you can ensure that you've got a performance management process that fairly evaluates every employee's contribution, and there's no inherent bias on that, and you take the time to do statistical analysis on what the starting position is for your employees before you make the decision, those two things coming together, and for those of us in comp, it's a great time to do that kind of statistical analysis over the summer when things are maybe a bit quieter. I think you can get really ahead of the game when it comes to sort of more end of year compensation cycles, so you can help the managers make the right decisions.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon. I see that we are at time and want to be respectful of all of our attendees' time. Thank you so much for everyone for attending this webinar today. Thank you, Natasha, Simon, and Josh, for speaking about your experiences in pay gap disclosures, and providing some information around that. Just a reminder, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I believe everyone here should have my email address. And we look forward to reviewing your disclosures soon. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you
So much. Take good care.